All right, now let's take a look at the different types of tests. So in general, we have three types of tests: unit tests, integration tests, and end-to-end tests. With unit tests, we test a component in isolation without external resources like file system, database, API endpoints, and so on. Now, this is the classic definition of unit test, irrespective of Angular. In Angular terms, that means testing a component in isolation without its template and any other resources that touch the file system, the database, API endpoints, the browser, and so on. So if our component is using a service to talk to an API endpoint, we're going to give it a fake instance of that service. We assume that service is doing its job properly, and we just want to focus on the functionality of the component. Or similarly, if the component is using a router, again, we're going to give it a fake router, not a real router that works with the browser API to take the user to a different page. Unit tests are easiest to write, they're super fast, but they don't give us much confidence about the functionality of our application. So let's take a look at an example. Here we have this simple vote component that you saw in my beginner's Angular course. Now I've simplified the code here, but basically we have this property, total votes, and this method that would change the value of this property. Now we can test this component in isolation. So we think of it as a plain TypeScript class, not an Angular component. So we don't care that it has a template. We just look at it as a simple TypeScript class. So this method is responsible for changing the state of this class. So we can call this method in our test and then inspect the value of the total votes property. If it's updated properly, that means this method is working. So writing this test is very easy, as you will see later in the section. However, if there's a problem in the bindings and the template for this component, we will not know until runtime. For example, if we forget to bind the click event of this button to the upvote method, our component is not going to function properly. And that's when we use an integration test. With an integration test, we test the component with external resources. Once again, this is the classic definition of integration tests. In the Angular world, that means testing a component along with its template. So instead of looking at this class as a plain TypeScript class, we need to look at it as an Angular component. And that means we need to run our test in an Angular environment. So we need to instruct Angular to compile this class along with its template. As you might guess, this kind of test requires a little bit more code than a simple unit test. There is some setup code because we have to put this class in an Angular environment. We need to deal with modules, dependency injection, and so on. However, we get more confidence about the functionality of our component. So this is integration tests. Now, if our component is using a service to talk to an API endpoint, again, similar to our unit tests, we want to give it a fake implementation. Now, in some ways, this looks a little bit like unit tests. And some developers can argue that this is actually a kind of unit test because we're still testing this component in isolation without a real service or a real router. However, I still see this in the category of integration tests because our tests involve testing a couple of pieces together, a component and its template, which is often in a separate file. So that's why I personally see this kind of test as an integration test, because we're testing the integration of our component class with its template. Now you may disagree with me and still think of this as a unit test, and that's perfectly fine. But let's not get hung up on the terminology. But for the rest of the course, I'm going to refer to the tests that involve the integration of a component and its template as integration tests, and tests that work with a component in isolation without its template as unit tests. Now we can write a few integration tests for this component, and all these tests may pass. However, when we run the application and use it like an end user, the application may still not work as we expect, because we're still looking at individual components, not the entire application as a whole. So that's when we use end-to-end tests. So with end-to-end tests, we test the entire application as a whole. So we simulate a real user. We launch the application in the browser, perhaps we log in, put in the username and password, click here and there, navigate to the target page, click on this upvote button, and then ensure that the total votes is updated in our HTML page properly. Now with this kind of test, we get a lot more confidence about the functionality of our application, However, these tests are very slow because each test is going to launch the application in the browser, navigate to the home page, then perhaps do a few clicks here and there to get to a target page and do something. So that's why these tests are slow. But they're also very fragile. A simple change in our HTML markup can easily break these tests, even if the application is working properly. So ideally, we want to spend most of our time writing unit and integration tests and write very few end-to-end tests only for the key functions of the application. But we're not going to test all the edge cases with end-to-end tests, like something being null, something being out of range, and so on. We use unit tests for those scenarios. So here are the three main types of tests. Now, as I told you, unit tests are easier to write. So in this section, we're going to focus entirely on unit tests, and then I will cover integration tests in the next section. All right, next we're going to look at the fundamentals of unit testing.